Have you ever had one of those moments where a simple repair job turns into something that completely changes your perspective on life? Where what starts as fixing a broken appliance becomes fixing something much deeper in the human heart? Today, I'm sharing a story that still gives me chills every time I think about it. Because sometimes the most profound connections happen in the most unexpected places, like a cramped laundry room on a Tuesday morning in November. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jake Martinez, and I'm a 38-year-old appliance repair technician trying to rebuild my life in Oakwood Heights, Ohio. 6 months ago, my small repair business went under in Cleveland after a series of bad investments and even worse luck. Divorce papers were still fresh in my filing cabinet, my confidence was shot, and I was starting over in a town where nobody knew my name or my failures. Some days I wondered if I'd made the right choice leaving everything behind. But desperation has a way of making decisions for you. That particular Tuesday morning felt like any other as I loaded my van with tools and headed out for service calls. The autumn air was crisp, leaves were scattered across sidewalks like nature's confetti, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from chimneys in the quiet suburban neighborhood. Oakwood Heights was the kind of place where people still waved at strangers and left their porch lights on for deliveries. It felt like stepping back in time, which was exactly what my bruised soul needed. My first call was at 847 Maple Street, a modest ranch-style house with powder blue siding and white shutters that had seen better decades. The front yard was meticulously maintained despite the season, with perfectly trimmed hedges and a small garden that showed signs of someone who truly cared about their home. A ceramic garden gnome wearing a tiny red hat sat guard by the front steps, and wind chimes hung from the porch ceiling, creating a gentle melody in the morning breeze. I grabbed my toolbox and walked up the concrete path, noticing how the welcome mat was positioned with mathematical precision and the house numbers were polished to a shine. Before I could even knock, the front door opened to reveal a woman who immediately commanded attention despite her small stature. Margaret Thompson, though she insisted I call her Maggie, was 91 years old and possessed the kind of presence that made you understand why elementary school children had probably both feared and adored her during her teaching career. Her silver hair was styled in soft waves that framed a face marked by laugh lines and the wisdom that comes from 9 decades of living. She wore a burgundy cardigan over a cream-colored blouse, both pressed to perfection, and her brown eyes held a sharpness that suggested her mind was as keen as ever. "You must be Jake from Martinez Appliance Repair," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm Maggie Thompson, and I have a washing machine that's decided to stage a rebellion against me." There was humor in her tone, but also a hint of frustration that spoke to larger concerns than just dirty laundry. I smiled and followed her through a living room that told the story of a full life well lived. Family photographs covered every surface, showing decades of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. The furniture was classic but well-maintained, with crocheted doilies and a coffee table that held neat stacks of magazines and a crossword puzzle book with several pages already completed in precise handwriting. "The laundry room is this way," Maggie said, leading me down a narrow hallway lined with more family photos. "I should warn you, it's not the most spacious work environment. This house was built in 1962, back when laundry rooms were afterthoughts, rather than the luxury spas they design nowadays." She wasn't kidding about the space. The laundry room was barely large enough for the washer and dryer, with a small utility sink squeezed into the corner and shelves above holding detergent, fabric softener, and various cleaning supplies organized with military precision. The washing machine, a white front-loading model that looked to be about 15 years old, sat silent and sulking like a teenager who'd been grounded. "What seems to be the problem?" I asked, setting down my toolbox and immediately feeling the confined space close in around me. Maggie folded her arms and regarded the machine with the same expression she probably once used on misbehaving students. "It fills with water just fine, agitates for about 30 seconds, then stops completely. No spinning, no draining, nothing. Just sits there like it's given up on life entirely. She paused, then added with a wry smile, "Rather like how I feel. Some mornings, actually." I knelt down to examine the machine, checking the obvious things first. The power cord was securely plugged in, the door was properly closed, and the settings appeared correct. As I worked, Maggie remained in the doorway, watching my every move with the keen attention of someone who'd spent decades observing human behavior. "You know," she said after a few minutes of comfortable silence, "in my 50 years of homeownership, I've had more repair technicians in this house than I care to count. Plumbers, electricians, heating specialists, you name it. Most of them treat me like I'm either invisible or incompetent because of my age." Her tone remained conversational, but there was an edge that suggested this was a sore subject. I looked up from where I was checking the machine's drain hose. That's unfortunate. In my experience, homeowners who've been maintaining their property for decades usually know their houses better than anyone else. Maggie's expression softened slightly. "Well, that's refreshing to hear. Most young men your age seem to assume that anyone over 70 has lost the ability to think clearly." She paused, studying me more intently. "You're different, though. I can tell you're actually listening when I explain the problem, not just waiting for me to stop talking so you can take over." Something in her voice made me pause my work and give her my full attention. There was loneliness there, hidden beneath the confident exterior, and I recognized it because I'd been carrying my own version for months. "Being heard is important," I said simply, "especially when it comes to problems in your own home." "Exactly," Maggie said, her eyes brightening. "This house has been my sanctuary for 32 years. My husband Harold and I bought it when he got promoted to supervisor at the plant. We raised our daughter Emma here, celebrated her graduation, her wedding, watched our granddaughter take her first steps in that living room." Her voice grew quieter. "Harold passed 3 years ago, and Emma lives in Seattle now with her family. She calls every Sunday, but..." She trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the air between us. I understood. Phone calls and video. Chats, no matter how well-intentioned, couldn't fill the silence of an empty house or provide someone to share the small daily moments that make up a life. I returned to examining the washing machine, but now with a different perspective. This wasn't just an appliance repair anymore. This machine represented independence, the ability to maintain her home and routine without having to ask for help or admit that some tasks were becoming difficult. After checking the standard components, I discovered the issue was with the door lock assembly. The mechanism was worn and wasn't properly engaging, which caused the machine's safety system to prevent the wash cycle from continuing. It was a common problem with older front-loading machines, and fortunately, one I could fix with parts I had in my van. "Good news," I told Maggie as I stood up and brushed dust off my knees. "It's the door lock mechanism. I can replace it today and have you back to doing laundry within the hour." Relief washed over her features. Oh, thank goodness. I was beginning to worry I'd have to replace the entire machine and on my fixed income. She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood the implication. "No need for that," I assured her. "This is a quality machine. With proper maintenance, it should give you several more years of service." As I headed out to my van to retrieve the replacement part, I noticed a woman next door working in her garden despite the cool weather. She looked to be in her mid-40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and dirt-stained gardening gloves that suggested she took her landscaping seriously. "You must be the repair guy," she called out cheerfully, straightening up and wiping her hands on her jeans. "I'm Linda Rodriguez. I live next door and keep an eye on Maggie when I can." I walked over to the fence that separated the properties. "Jake Martinez, nice to meet you. Maggie seems like a wonderful woman." Linda's expression grew more serious. "She is, but I worry about her. She's incredibly independent and proud, which I admire. But she's also alone in that big house most of the time. Her daughter Emma is great, but Seattle might as well be on the moon when you need someone to help with daily things. Has she considered moving closer to her daughter? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. We've all suggested it, but Maggie won't hear of it. That house represents everything she and Harold built together. She says she'd rather struggle there than feel like a burden somewhere else. Linda sighed and looked toward Maggie's house, with genuine affection. I try to check on her regularly, bring over extra food when I cook too much, that sort of thing. But she's stubborn about accepting help. I nodded, understanding that dynamic from my own experience with elderly relatives. Pride can be both a strength and a limitation. Exactly, Linda agreed. Oh, and heads up about David Chen, our mail carrier. He's got quite the crush on Maggie, though she pretends not to notice. He's a sweet man, recently widowed himself. But Maggie keeps everyone at arm's length these days. Back in the laundry room, I began the process of replacing the door lock assembly. It was delicate work in the confined space, requiring me to partially disassemble the front panel of the machine, while Maggie watched from the doorway, occasionally asking questions about what I was doing. "You're very thorough," she observed, as I carefully removed screws and labeled them so I could reassemble everything correctly. Harold was like that. He said if something was worth doing, it was worth doing right the first time. "Smart man," I replied, working to disconnect the old lock mechanism. My father taught me the same thing. He always said that shortcuts in repair work usually just create bigger problems later. "What kind of work did your father do?" Maggie asked, settling into a small folding chair she'd retrieved from somewhere. "He was a mechanic, specialized in classic cars. Taught me that every machine has its own personality, its own way of telling you what's wrong if you know how to listen." I paused in my work, suddenly missing my father more acutely than I had in months. He passed away 5 years ago, but I still hear his voice sometimes when I'm troubleshooting a particularly stubborn problem. Maggie nodded knowingly. Harold was an engineer, always tinkering with something in the basement workshop. I can still hear him humming while he worked, the same 3 songs over and over. She smiled at the memory. Funny how the people we love never really leave us, even when they're gone. As I continued working, our conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic. Maggie told me about her teaching career, how she'd started in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Ohio before moving to the district in Oakwood Heights, where she'd spent the majority of her career. She spoke with genuine affection about her students, many of whom had stayed in touch over the years and still sent her Christmas cards with updates about their families. "Teaching was my calling," she said, her eyes taking on a distant look. "Every September, I'd get 30 new little minds to shape and nurture. Some were eager learners, others needed more patience and creativity, but they all had potential. The hardest part about retiring wasn't giving up the work itself, but losing that sense of purpose, of being needed." I understood that feeling more than she knew. Since my business had failed and my marriage had ended, I'd been struggling with my own sense of purpose, wondering if I was just going through the motions of rebuilding a life that might collapse again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Do you miss it?" I asked as I began installing the new lock assembly. "Every day," Maggie admitted. "Not the paperwork or the politics, but the connections. The moment when a struggling student finally grasps a difficult concept, the pride in their eyes when they accomplish something they thought was impossible. There's nothing quite like being part of someone's growth and discovery." As I worked to connect the new mechanism, I realized that Maggie was doing exactly that for me, though she probably didn't know it. Her stories and insights were helping me see my own situation from a different perspective, reminding me that setbacks didn't have to define the future. The installation was going smoothly until I encountered a complication. The new lock assembly was slightly different from the original, requiring an adjustment to the door frame that I hadn't anticipated. It meant more disassembly and a longer repair time than I'd promised. "I'm sorry," I told Maggie as I realized the scope of additional work needed. "This is going to take longer than I thought. The replacement part doesn't quite match the original configuration." "Don't apologize for doing the job correctly," Maggie said firmly. "I'd rather wait for it to be fixed properly than have you rush and leave me with bigger problems." She paused, then added with a mischievous smile, "Besides, it's nice to have someone to talk to for a change. Most days, my only conversations are with the cats that wander through my yard." As if summoned by her words, a large orange tabby appeared in the hallway, regarding us both with the aloof curiosity that only cats can master. "That's Rusty," Maggie explained. "He doesn't belong to anyone in particular, but he's adopted the entire neighborhood. I may have encouraged his visits with the occasional treat." Rusty approached cautiously, sniffed at my toolbox with obvious disapproval, then settled into a sunny spot where he could observe my work while maintaining his dignity. His presence seemed to relax Maggie even further, and she began sharing more personal stories about her life in the house. She told me about the ice storm 10 years ago that had knocked out power for a week, how Harold had rigged a camping stove in the kitchen so they could still have hot meals. She described the summer they'd hosted Emma's wedding reception in the backyard, stringing lights between the trees and setting up tables on the lawn. Her voice grew softer when she mentioned the quiet evening when Harold had suffered his heart attack, how she'd held his hand in the ambulance and promised him she'd be okay. "The hardest part," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "isn't the big milestones or holidays. It's the small moments. Having coffee in the morning with no one to share the crossword clues, watching a funny commercial and having no one to laugh with, coming home from the grocery store and realizing no one missed me while I was gone." I stopped working for a moment, struck by the profound sadness in her words. Here was a woman who had lived a full life, contributed to her community, raised a family, and yet she felt invisible and forgotten. It seemed fundamentally wrong that someone with so much wisdom and love to offer should spend her days in solitude. "I can't imagine how difficult that must be," I said carefully, "losing a life partner after so many years together." Maggie wiped her eyes with a tissue she'd pulled from her cardigan pocket. "I'm sorry. I don't usually unload on strangers like this. It's just..." She paused, searching for words. "Domestic life gets lonely at 91. You spend decades caring for others, making sure everyone else's needs are met, and then suddenly you're the only one left to care for." Her words hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about a broken washing machine or even about Maggie's isolation. It was about the fundamental human need for connection, for mattering to someone else, for being seen and valued. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to nurturing others, and now she was forgotten in her own home, invisible to a world that seemed to have moved on without her. I realized that my own struggles with loneliness and purposelessness paled in comparison to what Maggie was experiencing. I had time to rebuild, opportunities to start over, the possibility of new relationships and adventures. But at 91, with limited mobility and dwindling social connections, Maggie's world was shrinking with each passing day. The weight of her words settled over the small laundry room like a heavy blanket. Here I was, a stranger who had simply come to fix her washing machine, and she had trusted me with her deepest fears and vulnerabilities. It was both an honor and a responsibility I hadn't expected when I'd knocked on her door that morning. As I resumed my work on the machine, my mind was racing with thoughts about aging, community, and the way society often discards its elderly members once they're no longer considered productive. Maggie had spent 5 decades shaping young minds, contributing to her community, paying taxes, and being a good neighbor. Now, when she needed support and companionship most, she was largely alone with her memories and her quiet desperation. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was working to fix her washing machine so she could maintain her independence, what she really needed was interdependence, connections with others, opportunities to contribute and feel valued, people who would miss her if she wasn't there. I made a decision in that cramped laundry room, surrounded by the scent of fabric softener and the gentle humming of the dryer. This repair job was going to be just the beginning of something larger, though I didn't yet know what form it would take. All I knew was that Maggie Thompson deserved better than to spend her remaining years feeling invisible and forgotten. The washing machine would be fixed within the hour, but addressing the loneliness that had prompted her heartbreaking confession was going to require a different kind of repair entirely, one that involved more than just tools and replacement parts. It was going to require time, patience, and the kind of human connection that had become increasingly rare in our fast-paced, technology-driven world. As I carefully aligned the new door lock mechanism and began the process of reassembly, I found myself hoping that Maggie's trust in me was the first step toward building something meaningful. Not just for her, but for both of us. Sometimes the most important repairs happen not to machines, but to hearts and spirits that have been worn down by time and circumstance. The morning was far from over, and I had a feeling that by the time I packed up my tools and left Maple Street, both our lives would be changed in ways neither of us could yet imagine. By Wednesday morning, I found myself thinking about Maggie Thompson more than I cared to admit. Her words about domestic life being lonely at 91 had echoed in my mind through a restless night, and I woke up with an unusual sense of urgency that had nothing to do with my scheduled service calls. The washing machine was running perfectly after yesterday's repair, but something told me my connection to 847 Maple Street was far from finished. I had just finished loading my van when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown local number. "Jake, this is Maggie Thompson. I hope you don't mind, but Linda gave me your number. Something strange happened last night, and I could use a second opinion if you have time today. Nothing urgent, just unsettling." The message surprised me, for several reasons. First, that Maggie had reached out at all seemed significant given her obvious struggle with accepting help. Second, the vague nature of her concern suggested this wasn't about appliances or typical household problems. I found myself genuinely worried about what might have unsettled a woman who seemed unflappable. I texted back immediately. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. I can stop by this morning if that works for you." Her response came quickly. "Maggie, please." And yes, that would be wonderful. I'll put the coffee on. The morning air was even crisper than yesterday, with frost covering car windshields and the kind of pale gray sky that promised winter wasn't far behind. As I drove through the quiet streets of Oakwood Heights, I noticed details I'd missed the day before. Halloween decorations were still scattered across front yards, jack-o'-lanterns in various stages of decay, sitting on porches next to early Thanksgiving displays. It was the time of year when the holiday season began in earnest, and I realized, with a pang, that Maggie would likely be spending most of them alone. When I pulled up to her house, I immediately noticed what had probably unsettled her. 3 large packages sat on her front porch, despite the fact that it was barely 8 in the morning and mail delivery typically didn't happen until afternoon. More concerning was that her welcome mat had been moved several feet from its usual, precise position by the door, and there were muddy footprints on the porch steps that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. Maggie answered the door before I could knock, still wearing her bathrobe but with her hair already styled and her eyes alert with concern. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, ushering me inside. "I know this might seem like nothing to someone your age, but when you've lived alone as long as I have, you develop a sixth sense about when things aren't quite right." She led me to the kitchen where coffee was indeed brewing, filling the small space with a warm, comforting aroma that contrasted sharply with the tension in her voice. "I went to bed around 10 last night, same as always. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the front porch. Not just someone walking by, but deliberately moving around out there for several minutes. I poured myself coffee from the pot she indicated and settled into the same chair I'd occupied briefly yesterday. "Did you look outside?" I was afraid to, Maggie admitted, wrapping her own hands around her coffee mug like it was an anchor. At my age, confronting prowlers isn't exactly advisable. But this morning when I went to get the newspaper, I found those packages that weren't there when I went to bed. The thing is, none of them are addressed to me. That explained the unsettled feeling I'd had looking at her porch. What do the labels say? Maggie pulled a small notebook from her robe. Pocket, consulting it with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent decades keeping detailed records. One is addressed to the Hendersons at 823 Maple Street, one to the Kowalskis at 891 Maple, and one to someone named Patterson at 856 Maple. All neighbors, but none of them particularly close to this address. I frowned, considering the implications. That's definitely not a delivery mistake. 3 wrong addresses from the same route, and at 2 in the morning? Exactly what I thought, Maggie said, her voice gaining strength as she realized I was taking her concerns seriously. I've been in this neighborhood for over 30 years, and I know the normal patterns. Delivery trucks, mail schedules, even which neighbors receive regular packages. This felt deliberate. As if summoned by our conversation, there was a knock at the front door. Maggie tensed immediately, but I recognized the cheerful voice calling out before she could worry. Maggie, it's Linda. I brought muffins and gossip, not necessarily in that order. Maggie's relief was visible as she went to let her neighbor in. Linda Rodriguez appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying a wicker basket and wearing the kind of concerned expression that suggested she'd already heard about the overnight disturbance. I saw Jake's van and figured you were telling him about last night, Linda said without preamble, setting her basket on the counter. Mrs. Patterson from down the street called me this morning. Apparently, she had the same thing happen. Packages that weren't hers left on her porch sometime during the night. How many houses? I asked, my repair technician's instinct for systematic troubleshooting kicking in. Linda counted on her fingers. At least 4 that I know of so far, but I haven't called everyone yet. All elderly residents living alone. All packages that belong to other neighbors. She paused significantly. All packages that were probably supposed to be delivered to houses where younger people live, people who might notice if their deliveries went missing. The pattern was becoming clear, and it wasn't one I liked. Someone's using your porches as temporary storage, counting on the fact that elderly residents might not immediately know what to do about misdelivered packages. Maggie nodded grimly. Or might be too intimidated to confront whoever comes back to collect them. But why? Linda asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. I'd seen similar schemes in Cleveland. Probably stolen packages being redistributed. Take packages from front porches in busy neighborhoods where they might be quickly missed, then stash them temporarily at houses where the residents are less likely to immediately report them or chase after the thieves. The 3 of us sat in contemplative silence for a moment, the cozy kitchen suddenly feeling less secure. It was one thing for Maggie to deal with the ordinary loneliness of aging. It was another entirely for her to become a target for criminals who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity. We need to call the police, Linda said firmly. And tell them what? Maggie asked with a bitter laugh. That some packages were left on porches overnight? They'll think I'm a paranoid old woman seeing conspiracies where none exist. I understood her frustration. Police departments were overwhelmed with serious crimes, and package theft often fell into a gray area that was difficult to prove and even harder to prosecute. But the systematic targeting of elderly residents crossed a line that made this feel more serious than typical porch piracy. Maybe we need more information before we call, I suggested. If this is happening to multiple houses, there might be a pattern we can document. Security cameras, witness accounts, maybe even catching them in the act. Linda perked up at this. Mrs. Patterson has one of those doorbell cameras. If someone was on her porch last night, there might be footage. And the Kowalskis just installed a motion sensor light system after their garage was broken into last month, Maggie added, her teacher instincts for organization clearly engaged. If someone was moving around their property, it would have triggered. I found myself genuinely impressed by how quickly both women had shifted from victims to investigators. There was something deeply satisfying about watching Maggie's sharp mind focus on a problem she could actively solve, rather than the existential loneliness that had no easy answers. What if we organized the affected neighbors? I heard myself suggesting. Pool information, coordinate with each other, maybe even set up our own surveillance system? The moment the words left my mouth, I realized I'd said we and our, as if I was already part of this community. The strange thing was, it felt natural. For the first time in months, I was thinking about something beyond my own problems and rebuilding efforts. Maggie's eyes lit up with something I hadn't seen there before. Purpose. I like that idea. We could have a neighborhood meeting, get everyone on the same page about what's happening and how to respond. I can reach out to the other affected residents, Linda offered. Get them together for coffee this afternoon, maybe here if Maggie doesn't mind. I'd love that, Maggie said immediately, then caught herself. I mean, if you think it would be helpful. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing, I assured her. You're organizing. There's a difference. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, door-to-door visits, and impromptu detective work. Linda proved to be a natural coordinator, reaching out to neighbors with the kind of diplomatic persistence that suggested she'd done community organizing before. I found myself appointed as the technical consultant, helping residents check their security systems and documenting evidence with the thoroughness my father had drilled into me for repair work. By 2 o'clock, Maggie's living room was fuller than it had probably been since Harold's funeral. Mrs. Patterson, a spry 78-year-old with silver curls and fierce eyes, had brought printouts from her doorbell camera showing a shadowy figure in a dark hoodie moving packages around her porch at 2:15 a.m. The Kowalskis, a retired couple in their early 80s, contributed motion sensor logs that showed activity at their house during the same time frame. David Chen, the mail carrier, had arrived during his lunch break with official postal service insights that proved invaluable. He was a quiet man in his early 50s with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and his obvious nervousness around Maggie was endearing rather than awkward. "This isn't random," David said, studying the timeline we'd assembled on Maggie's coffee table. "Look at the pattern. All deliveries were moved from houses with young families or working couples to houses with elderly single residents. Someone's been watching your neighborhood, learning routines." "How would they know our routines?" asked Mrs. Patterson. David's expression grew troubled. "Mail delivery schedules, garbage pickup days, which houses have cars and driveways during work hours. Anyone watching for a few days could figure out who lives alone and might be less likely to immediately report suspicious activity." The systematic nature of the scheme was becoming more apparent and more unsettling. This wasn't opportunistic crime, but a calculated operation that specifically targeted the neighborhood's most vulnerable residents. "So what do we do?" asked Mr. Kowalski, a man whose engineering background was evident in his methodical questions and note-taking. I looked around the room at these people who had lived full lives, contributed to their community, and deserved to feel safe in their own homes. An idea was forming, inspired partly by my father's lessons about thoroughness and partly by the curious sense of purpose I was feeling for the first time in months. "We turn the tables," I said. "Instead of being passive targets, we become active observers. If they're watching us, we watch back." Maggie leaned forward with interest. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A communication network," I explained, the plan solidifying as I spoke. "Phone trees, regular check-ins, coordinated observation schedules. If someone's moving around the neighborhood at night, we make sure multiple people know about it immediately." "Like a neighborhood watch program," Linda said approvingly. "More than that," I continued. "We document everything, share information in real time, and make it clear that this neighborhood looks after its own. Criminals rely on isolation and fear. Community involvement is their worst nightmare. David nodded enthusiastically. I could help coordinate during my delivery route. Mail carriers see everything that happens in a neighborhood during the day. Mrs. Patterson was practically vibrating with excitement. And I have that doorbell camera system that sends alerts to my phone. I could monitor multiple angles if we set up a proper network. For the next hour, we planned like a military operation. Communication protocols, observation schedules, emergency procedures, even contingency plans for various scenarios. Maggie proved to be a natural leader, her decades of classroom management translating perfectly to community organization. But more than the practical planning, I was struck by the transformation in the room's energy. People who had introduced themselves as lonely neighbors were becoming a coordinated team. Stories were shared, connections made, and a sense of collective purpose emerged that had nothing to do with crime prevention and everything to do with community building. You know, Maggie said as the formal meeting wound down, this is the most engaged I've felt in years. Not just about the package situation, but about being part of something meaningful again. Mrs. Patterson nodded emphatically. I was just thinking the same thing. I've lived 3 houses down from you for 8 years, Maggie, and we've never had a real conversation until today. That's changing now, Linda declared. Crime or no crime, we're neighbors. We should act like it. As people began to leave, making plans for the evening's surveillance coordination, Maggie lingered near me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Jake, she said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. I waited, not sure what to expect. Yesterday, when I told you about domestic life being lonely at 91, you could have just finished the repair and left. Today, when I texted about something that wasn't even your job, you could have suggested I call the police and moved on with your day. She paused, studying my face. Why didn't you? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. The honest answer was complicated, involving my own recent experiences with loneliness, displacement, and the search for purpose. But looking at Maggie's expectant face, surrounded by the lingering warmth of community connection, I found a simpler truth. Because you matter, I said. Your safety matters, your concerns matter, and your contributions to this community matter. Maybe I needed to be reminded of that as much as you did. Maggie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Harold always said that the right people come into your life exactly when you need them most. I thought that was just romantic nonsense, but maybe he was on to something. As the afternoon transitioned to evening and our newly formed neighborhood, Watch prepared for its first coordinated night of observation, I realized that fixing Maggie's washing machine had indeed been just the beginning. We were building something here, not just a crime prevention network, but a community that had been fragmented by time, circumstance, and the isolating effects of modern life. The packages on Maggie's porch that morning had been intended as a violation of her security and peace of mind. Instead, they had become the catalyst for connections that might never have formed otherwise. Sometimes the most meaningful repairs happen not to appliances or even to individual problems, but to the social fabric that holds communities together. Tonight would tell us whether our planning and coordination could actually prevent crime. But regardless of what happened with the package thieves, something more important had already been accomplished. A group of people who had been living parallel lives in the same neighborhood were finally living connected ones. And for a 91-year-old retired teacher who had confessed that domestic life gets lonely, that connection might prove to be the most valuable repair of all. The first night of our organized surveillance passed without incident, but by Thursday evening, our little neighborhood watch had evolved into something none of us had expected. What started as a practical response to package theft had become a social experiment in community building that was changing all our lives in unexpected ways. Maggie had suggested hosting a potluck dinner before the second night of watching, reasoning that coordinated community action worked better when people actually knew each other beyond their addresses and security concerns. Her dining room table, which she admitted hadn't hosted a group meal since Harold's memorial service, was suddenly crowded with casserole dishes, homemade bread, and the kind of animated conversation that comes from people discovering they have more in common than they'd realized. I found myself officially invited, not as the repair technician who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time, but as someone the group had begun to consider essential to their planning and coordination. It was a role I hadn't expected to play, but one that filled a void in my life I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. David Chen had arrived early, ostensibly to help set up, but clearly motivated by any excuse to spend extra time around Maggie. He'd brought a magnificent apple pie that he'd obviously made himself, along with detailed maps of the neighborhood's delivery routes that showed patterns only a mail carrier would notice. "Look at this," David said, spreading his hand-drawn charts across Maggie's kitchen counter, while she arranged silverware with mathematical precision. Every house that was targeted for package drops is within a 3-block radius, all on streets with limited through traffic, and all belonging to residents who receive mail but very few packages. Mrs. Patterson, who had appointed herself as ZA, the group's technology coordinator, was reviewing footage from her doorbell camera with the intensity of a forensic investigator. "I've been comparing timestamps from 3 different camera angles, and I think I've identified at least 2 different people involved in this operation." Linda Rodriguez bustled in carrying a large pot of her famous chili, followed by the Kowalskis, with homemade rolls that filled the house with the warm scent of fresh bread. The energy in Maggie's home was completely different from the quiet melancholy that had characterized my first visit just 3 days earlier. "This feels like Thanksgiving," Maggie said to me quietly as we watched her neighbors make themselves comfortable in her living room. "I haven't had this many people in my house since Emma brought the grandchildren for Christmas 2 years ago." I could see the profound impact this gathering was having on her. The loneliness that had prompted her heartbreaking confession about domestic life at 91 seemed to have lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that was transforming not just her mood, but her entire demeanor. As we settled around, the expanded dining room table, with folding chairs borrowed from various neighbors, the conversation naturally flowed from surveillance logistics to personal stories. Mrs. Patterson shared tales from her career as a high school principal, including legendary battles with teenage troublemakers that made our current package thieves seem like minor nuisances. The Kowalskis talked about their recent struggles with technology, how their grandchildren in California tried to help them with video calls, but often ended up more frustrated than connected. "The thing about aging," Mr. Kowalski said thoughtfully, "is that the world keeps changing around you, but nobody bothers to explain the new rules. One day you understand how everything works, and the next day there are computers in your washing machine and criminals who steal packages by reorganizing them on different porches." "That's exactly right," Maggie agreed. "I spent 40 years teaching children how to adapt to new situations, but nobody teaches elderly people how to adapt to a world that seems designed for younger generations." David nodded earnestly. "My mother deals with the same thing. She's 73 and still sharp as a tack, but she feels left behind by all the technological changes. Simple things like ordering groceries online or setting up automatic bill payments become overwhelming obstacles." I found myself thinking about my own assumptions and biases. In my work, I often encountered elderly customers who seemed confused by modern appliances, and I'd attributed their struggles to declining mental capacity, rather than considering that they were simply dealing with technology that hadn't existed for most of their lives. "Maybe that's part of what we're building here," I suggested. "Not just crime prevention, but a support system that helps everyone stay connected and capable, regardless of age or technical expertise." Linda's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Like a skill-sharing network. I'm terrible with technology, but I can cook for an army and organize anything." Mrs. Patterson knows how security systems work. David understands logistics and delivery patterns, and Jake can fix anything mechanical. And I, Maggie said with a smile that reminded me of her teaching days, am excellent at coordinating people and keeping projects on track. The conversation continued as we cleared dishes and prepared for the evening's surveillance activities, but something had shifted in the group dynamic. We were no longer just neighbors dealing with a security problem. We were becoming an intentional community with shared resources and mutual support. As darkness fell, we implemented the communication system we'd developed the night before. David positioned himself near the main intersection where he could observe traffic patterns from his car. Mrs. Patterson monitored her camera feeds from her living room with her phone connected to a group chat that would alert everyone immediately. If she spotted suspicious activity, the Kowalskis took the eastern perimeter, while Linda and I covered the southern approach to the neighborhood. Maggie, despite her protests that she should be actively patrolling, had been assigned to central coordination from her kitchen, where she could maintain contact with everyone and serve as the hub for information sharing. It was a role that played to her organizational strengths while keeping her safely inside, though I suspected she would have preferred to be out in the field, with the rest of us. Around 10:30, Mrs. Patterson's voice crackled through the group chat with the first significant development. 2 individuals approaching from the north, dark clothing, moving deliberately between houses. They're not just walking through the neighborhood. David's response came immediately. I see them. White sedan parked 2 blocks away with the engine. Running. License plate partially obscured. The adrenaline rush was immediate and surprising. Here we were, a group of neighbors armed with nothing more than cell phones and determination, coordinating like a professional security team. The sense of collective purpose was intoxicating. They're at the Henderson house, Mrs. Patterson reported. Definitely moving packages around, not just delivering. Should we call the police now? Linda's voice carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Let's get more evidence first. Maggie's calm voice cut through the chatter. We need to document everything clearly so there's no question about what's happening. I found myself genuinely impressed by Maggie's leadership under pressure. Her decades of managing classroom chaos were clearly transferable skills. For the eyes, next 20 minutes, we tracked the suspects as they moved systematically through the neighborhood, relocating packages from houses where they were likely to be quickly missed to porches where elderly residents might not immediately realize the deliveries weren't theirs. The pattern was even more calculated than we'd suspected. They're at your house now, Maggie, David reported tensely. Through the group chat, we could hear Maggie moving carefully to her front window. I can see them clearly. 2 young men, probably early 20s. One is taking photos of each package with his phone before moving it. Photos? I asked. Probably documenting what they're taking so they can match stolen goods with buyer requests, Mrs. Patterson said grimly. This isn't random theft. It's organized retail crime. The implications were sobering. We weren't dealing with opportunistic teenagers grabbing packages for quick resale. This was a sophisticated operation that treated elderly residents as unwitting accomplices in a broader criminal enterprise. Okay, that's enough evidence, I said decisively. Time to call this in. But as Linda reached for her phone to contact police, something unexpected happened. A car pulled up directly in front of Maggie's house, and a young woman got out, approaching the 2 package manipulators with obvious familiarity. There's a third person, Maggie reported quietly. Young woman, maybe mid-20s, appears to be in charge. She's directing the others. Through my binoculars, I could see the woman clearly. She was well-dressed, professional-looking, carrying what appeared to be a tablet or clipboard. This wasn't a desperate criminal operation, but a business enterprise that happened to be illegal. She's taking inventory, Mrs. Patterson said with disgust. Checking items against some kind of list. David's voice cut through the group chat with a different kind of urgency. Guys, we have a problem. Another car just pulled up behind the first one. More people getting out. The situation was escalating beyond our ability to handle it safely. What had started as documentation for police reports was becoming a potentially dangerous confrontation. Everyone stay in position, but do not engage, Maggie commanded with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. Linda, call 911 now. David, can you safely get the license plates of both vehicles? Already on it, David replied. As Linda spoke rapidly to the emergency dispatcher, providing our location and a concise summary of what we'd observed, I realized how far we'd all come in just a few days. Maggie had transformed from an isolated elderly woman feeling invisible to the acknowledged leader of a coordinated community response. Mrs. Patterson had evolved from a cautious retiree to a surveillance expert. David had stepped up from shy mail carrier to reconnaissance specialist. The police arrived with impressive speed, probably motivated by Linda's clear description of organized criminal activity rather than simple package theft. 2 patrol cars approached from different directions, coordinating their response in a way that suggested they'd dealt with similar operations before. From our various observation points, we watched as the criminals attempted to scatter, only to discover that their exit routes were blocked by patrol cars positioned based on information we'd provided about the neighborhood's layout and traffic patterns. Looks like they're all being detained, David reported with satisfaction. As the police processed the scene, collecting evidence and interviewing suspects, our little surveillance team gradually reconvened at Maggie's house. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a mixture of pride and amazement at what we'd accomplished together. I can't believe we actually did that, Mrs. Patterson said, settling into Maggie's living room with a cup of tea that shook slightly in her hands. We caught actual criminals. More than that, Maggie said thoughtfully. We protected our community. Every package they were redistributing tonight would have resulted in someone not receiving items they needed, and eventually would have made all of us less trusting of our neighbors. A knock at the door interrupted our debriefing. Officer Martinez, a woman about my age with kind eyes and a professional demeanor, had come to collect formal statements and provide an update on what they'd discovered. Your coordination and documentation were exceptional, she told our assembled group. This appears to be part of a larger operation that's been targeting elderly residents across 3 counties. The evidence you gathered tonight, especially the photographs and timeline documentation, will be crucial for prosecution. She explained that the suspects had been operating a sophisticated scheme, stealing packages from busy residential areas and using elderly neighborhoods as temporary storage and redistribution centers. They specifically targeted houses where residents might be slow to report misdelivered packages or might assume the items were gifts from relatives they'd forgotten about. The woman who appeared to be in charge has been on our radar for months, Officer Martinez continued. But we could never catch her in the act until tonight. Your surveillance network provided the evidence we needed. As the officer prepared to leave, she handed Maggie a business card. I'd like to put you in touch with our community liaison officer. What you've built here could be a model for other neighborhoods dealing with similar issues. After Officer Martinez left, the 6 of us sat in Maggie's living room, processing what had just happened. We'd started the week as virtual strangers dealing with individual problems, and ended it as a functioning team that had successfully protected our community from organized criminals. So, what happens now? Linda asked. Do we just go back to being neighbors who wave politely when we see each other in the yard? I hope not, Maggie said immediately. I feel more alive and useful than I have in years. This week has reminded me what it means to be part of something bigger than myself. David nodded enthusiastically. My mail route covers 6 neighborhoods, and none of them have anything like what we've built here. People complain about crime and feeling disconnected, but nobody takes action to change it. I looked around the room at these people who had become so important to me in such a short time. Maggie was right about feeling useful and alive. For me, this week had provided something I hadn't even realized I was missing: a sense of belonging and purpose that went beyond simple economic survival. What if we formalized it? I heard myself suggesting. Not just as a crime watch, but as a genuine mutual support network. Skill sharing, social activities, emergency assistance, that kind of thing. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward with interest. You mean like an intentional community within the larger neighborhood? Exactly, Maggie said, her teacher instincts clearly engaged by the planning possibilities. We've proven we can coordinate effectively when necessary. Why not apply that coordination to making all our lives better on an ongoing basis? The conversation that followed was energizing and hopeful in ways I hadn't experienced since my divorce and business failure. We talked about regular dinners, shared gardening projects, technology tutorials, holiday celebrations, and emergency support systems. But underneath the practical planning was something more fundamental: the recognition that we had created real friendships and genuine community in a world where such connections were increasingly rare. As the evening wound down and people began to head home, Maggie asked me to stay behind for a moment. We stood on her front porch, looking out at a neighborhood that felt completely different from the one I'd first visited just 4 days earlier. Jake, she said quietly, I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for fixing my washing machine, but for treating my concerns seriously, for helping organize our response, for making me feel valuable again. I shook my head. You don't need to thank me, Maggie. If anything, I should be thanking you. This week has given me something I didn't even know I was looking for. She smiled, the kind of expression that contained decades of wisdom about human nature and the importance of connection. Harold used to say that the best communities aren't planned, they're discovered. People find each other when they need each other most, and if they're smart, they hold on tight. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since Tuesday morning. I'd come to Oakwood Heights to rebuild my career and start over after personal and professional failures. Instead, I'd found something much more valuable, a place where I belonged and people who valued my contributions. The washing machine repair that had brought me to Maggie's house was completed days ago, but the real work was just beginning. We were building something sustainable and meaningful, something that addressed not just immediate security concerns, but the deeper human needs for connection, purpose, and community that modern life often failed to provide. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but for the first time in months, I was genuinely excited to see what came next. 3 months later, on a crisp February morning, I found myself standing in Maggie's kitchen again, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. Instead of responding to a repair emergency, I was here for our weekly community breakfast, a tradition that had evolved naturally from our initial crisis response into something none of us could imagine living without. The washing machine that had brought us together hummed quietly in the background, a reliable presence that had never given Maggie another moment of trouble. But more importantly, the house itself had been transformed from a place of quiet solitude into the unofficial headquarters of what we'd come to call the Maple Street Collective, a mutual support network that had become a model for other neighborhoods throughout Oakwood Heights. Maggie stood at the stove, expertly managing scrambled eggs for 8 people while simultaneously coordinating the morning's agenda with the efficiency that had made her legendary among former students. At 91, she had found a new calling that utilized all her organizational skills while providing the sense of purpose she'd been missing since retirement. David, did you remember to pick up the community newsletter from the printer? She called out to our mail carrier, who was setting up folding chairs around the expanded dining table. Already in the van, David replied with the kind of easy familiarity that had developed between them over the months. Their relationship had deepened into genuine companionship, built on shared interests in community organizing and a mutual respect that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with intellectual partnership. Mrs. Patterson was connecting her laptop to Maggie's television, preparing to show footage from the neighborhood's expanded security camera network, which had become a model for community-based crime prevention. The police department now regularly consulted with our group about implementation strategies for other areas. "The Henderson grandchildren are visiting this weekend," she announced to the room. "Their parents want them to meet the neighborhood heroes who caught the package thieves. Apparently, we've become local celebrities." Linda Rodriguez laughed as she arranged fresh muffins on a serving plate. "I still can't believe the mayor wants to present us with a community service award. 6 months ago, most of us barely knew each other's names." The Kowalskis were reviewing plans for the community garden project we'd be starting in the spring, a shared space that would provide fresh vegetables for everyone while creating another opportunity for neighbors to work together on something meaningful. Their engineering backgrounds had proved invaluable in designing irrigation systems and plotting optimal crop rotations. As for me, I was officially the group's technical coordinator and unofficial project manager, roles that had expanded far beyond anything I'd imagined when I first knocked on Maggie's door. My appliance repair business had grown exponentially, partly due to referrals from the community network, but more importantly, I'd discovered skills in organization and leadership that I never knew I possessed. "Before we start the formal meeting," Maggie announced as everyone settled around the table with plates of food, "I have something important to share." The room quieted immediately. Over the months, we'd all learned to recognize when Maggie had something significant to communicate. "Emma called last night with some news," Maggie continued, her voice carrying a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite identify. "She's been offered a promotion that would require relocating to Chicago. She wanted to know if I'd consider moving there to be closer to her family." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Emma's concern for her mother's well-being was completely understandable, especially given Maggie's age and the fact that she lived alone. But the idea of losing her felt devastating to all of us. "What did you tell her?" Linda asked quietly. Maggie smiled, the expression containing all the confidence and determination that had made her such an effective community leader. "I told her that while I appreciated her concern, I'm not alone anymore. I have a community here, responsibilities, people who depend on me and whom I depend on in return." The relief in the room was palpable, but Maggie wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "Emma's question made me realize something important. What we've built here can't depend entirely on any one person. We need to formalize our structure, document our processes, and make sure our network can continue to grow and adapt regardless of individual circumstances." It was a sobering reminder that communities, like the people who create them, are fragile and require intentional maintenance to survive and thrive. But it was also an opportunity to solidify something that had already proven its value. David leaned forward with interest. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to become an official neighborhood association," Maggie said, "with bylaws, elected leadership, formal partnerships with city services, and a long-term plan for sustainability." Mrs. Patterson nodded enthusiastically. "We could apply for grant funding for community improvement projects, maybe even get support for expanding the security camera network to other neighborhoods. And we could create educational programs," Linda added. "Share what we've learned about organizing effective mutual support systems." I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what Maggie was proposing. What had started as an emergency response to package theft had evolved into something that addressed fundamental issues facing communities everywhere: social isolation, security concerns, lack of intergenerational connection, and the erosion of civic engagement. "There's something else," I said, an idea forming as I spoke. "What if we documented our story? Not just the organizational structure, but the human story of how we came together and what we've accomplished." "You mean like a book?" asked Mr. Kowalski. Or a presentation we could give to other communities, I clarified. We've proven that it's possible to create meaningful connections and effective cooperation even in a world that seems designed to keep people isolated. That's a message worth sharing. Maggie's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm I'd come to associate with her best ideas. I love that concept. We could create a template that other neighborhoods could adapt to their specific circumstances and needs. The conversation that followed was energizing and productive, touching on everything from legal requirements for forming a neighborhood association to strategies for replicating our success in different communities. But underneath the practical planning was a deeper recognition of what we'd achieved together. When I'd first met Maggie, she'd confessed that domestic life gets lonely at 91. That loneliness had been the catalyst for everything that followed, but it was no longer an accurate description of her existence. She was now the acknowledged leader of a thriving community network, consulted by city officials and sought out by other neighborhoods wanting to replicate our success. More than that, she had rediscovered the sense of purpose and value that had defined her teaching career. Every morning brought new challenges and opportunities to make a difference in people's lives. The isolation and invisibility she'd feared were permanent features of aging had been replaced by engagement and influence that honored her experience while utilizing her skills. "There's one more thing I want to say," Maggie announced as our formal meeting wound down and people began clearing dishes. "Jake, when you first came to fix my washing machine, I told you that in 50 years I'd never seen a better handyman. I want to amend that statement." I looked up from stacking plates, curious about where this was heading. "You're not just a good handyman," Maggie continued. "You're someone who understands that the most important repairs aren't always to machines or appliances. Sometimes what needs fixing is the connections between people, the sense of community that holds neighborhoods together." Her words hit me with unexpected emotional force. In the months since my divorce and business failure, I'd been focused on rebuilding my career and establishing financial stability. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed to rebuild my sense of self-worth and belonging until this community had provided both. "The truth is," I replied, "I came here thinking I was just going to fix your washing machine and move on to the next service call. Instead, you all helped me fix parts of my life I didn't even realize were broken." David nodded knowingly. "That's what real community does. It provides a place where people can contribute their strengths while finding support for their weaknesses." As people prepared to leave for their various daily activities, I lingered in Maggie's kitchen, helping her finish the cleanup while reflecting on how dramatically all our lives had changed since that first Tuesday morning in November. "Maggie," I said as we loaded the last dishes into the dishwasher, "do you ever think about what would have happened if your washing machine hadn't broken that day?" She considered the question seriously, as she did all hypothetical scenarios. "I suppose I would have continued feeling invisible and forgotten, slowly withdrawing from the world until I became exactly the isolated elderly person that society expects me to be. And I would have continued going through the motions of rebuilding my life without ever discovering what it means to be part of something meaningful," I added. Maggie smiled, the expression containing all the warmth and wisdom that had made her such an effective teacher and community leader. "But that's not what happened, is it? Instead, a broken appliance became the beginning of something none of us could have planned, but all of us needed." As I prepared to leave for my service calls, Maggie handed me a small wrapped package. "Just a little thank you," she said, "for everything." Inside was a photo in a simple frame, taken during our community Christmas party the month before. It showed all of us gathered around Maggie's dining table, laughing at something Mrs. Patterson had said, looking for all the world like a family that had chosen each other rather than being related by blood. On the back, in Maggie's precise handwriting, was a message. "Sometimes the most important repairs happen to hearts that have forgotten how to hope. Thank you for fixing mine." 6 months later, as I write this story, The Maple Street Collective has become a registered neighborhood association with 47 member households and a waiting list of people wanting to move to our area, specifically to be part of our community network. We've consulted with 12 other neighborhoods about replicating our model, and Maggie has been invited to speak at conferences about innovative approaches to aging in place. The washing machine still runs perfectly, requiring only routine maintenance and the occasional minor adjustment. But more importantly, the community it helped create continues to grow and evolve, providing proof that meaningful connections and effective cooperation are possible even in an increasingly disconnected world. Every Tuesday morning, I still make a point of stopping by Maggie's house, though now it's for coffee and conversation rather than emergency repairs. She's 92 now, sharper and more engaged than many people half her age, surrounded by friends who value her wisdom and depend on her leadership. Domestic life, it turns out, doesn't have to be lonely at any age when you're part of a community that understands the difference between fixing things and fixing what really matters. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.